Hello, everybody. My name is Boulevard, and welcome to the Beyond the Bandlewood Tournament Tactician tier list. All that good stuff. Going to give you a meta rundown and let you know what you're looking at going into the Beyond the Bandlewood seasonal this upcoming weekend. Now, things look a lot different than they did at Worlds, off of two major factors. Number one is the injection of Ziggs Poppy into the meta. Number two is a bit more refinement on the side of something like Bandle Pirates. So we've got in a lot more burn refinement, which pushes down something like Draven Caitlyn and increases something like Lee Sin, where Eye of the Dragon gets to be uncontested and really start to take over the game, give you a lot of life back in a lot of these scenarios, and then you still have this game-ending finisher. But we'll get into that. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, so we'll move into that a little bit later. Sivir Demacia and Feel the Rush have moved out of Tier 1 as well. I've got a couple matchup charts that I want to take a look at with you, so we'll get into that. But I want to start off by saying that the two lineups that have been consistently performing over the last 2 weeks, since everything kind of settled, since the introduction of Ziggs Poppy, number one is Ziggs Poppy, Sivir Demacia, and Plunder. And the second one is Ziggs Poppy, Draven Scion, and Bandle Pirates. Now, these have been performing in single elimination tournaments, and they haven't been appearing en masse. They've been winning tournaments, but that doesn't mean everything, right? Because obviously you're still going to see more Nami elusives than, I just mentioned in that lineup. You're probably not actually going to see that much Sivir Demacia for a reason that I'll get into a little bit later. But those are like the two lineups that we're kind of looking at as our standard for like, hey, this is what people are bringing. And I think Ziggs Poppy, Bandle Pirates, and Draven Scion would be a little bit more popular than the former. Sivir Demacia, not the easiest deck in the world to play. Plunder, it's kind of hit or miss. There are some consistency issues across the board in nearly every lineup. So if you do end up falling out of the seasonal because your decks just didn't perform, it's not necessarily a decision that you made that you can be faulted for, because a lot of the decks like Nami and Plunder and Sivir Demacia and even sometimes Draven Scion, like if you don't draw the Scion or you don't hit a steady flow of Lost Souls, we're going to go down to the tier list, talk about everything, look into some matchup charts, and get you all prepped. Here's where things get a little bit funky. If we take a step back and really take in the meta and look at it, the only deck that is really appearing en masse is Draven Scion. So if you're looking for a hard counter or even a soft counter strategy, Draven Scion feels like the only deck that you could reasonably target, because if you go to soft counter something like Ziggs Poppy, it's a feasible strategy, right? Because the implication of soft countering is that I still can beat other decks. I just like am favored into Ziggs Poppy across the board. I don't think you're ever going to see Ziggs Poppy and Nami Zoe in the same lineup. It's just not something that we've seen happen. Their matchup charts are pretty different. And that means that the one thing that you need to be cognizant of is that if you are looking to either soft counter Nami Zoe or Ziggs Poppy, you need to be able to handle a lineup that has the other deck in it. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Like if you're looking at a soft counter lineup for Ziggs Poppy and you're like, oh man, all my decks fold to Nami Zoe, but you like have already committed to banning Scion decks, then you're in for a bit of a rough ride. So that's just something to keep in mind. Number two, despite the fact that like Draven, Scion, Nami, and Ziggs Poppy are sort of like three of the very powerful decks that ban targets, the powerhouses of the meta, you're probably not going to see all three of them in the lineup. They have wildly different matchup charts, and because of the inconsistencies of the decks, like if Draven Scion doesn't hit Scion on 7, the deck is significantly weaker. If Nami Zoe doesn't hit Nami on 3, like the deck is significantly weaker. Like if they can't find their champions on curve, these decks look totally different. So you can't just sort of brute force your way through like you've been able to in the past with things like the Aphelios meta and the TFIz meta, where like, yeah, I just put all my 3 power decks in a lineup and I call it a day and I ban whatever is scariest for my opponent. Our decks are too inherently inconsistent for that to work out, which, by the way, if you do stick to a lineup and you go in this weekend and your decks just kind of falter, don't take it too harshly. Things are pretty volatile right now. The decks are a little bit more swingy than I'm necessarily in love with, but it is just something to keep in mind. Maybe you did everything right and you didn't top the seasonal. That happens. Just try to buck up and keep the energy for next time. This matchup chart, I feel, is something that the meta is going to live and die by. This is the Draven Scion matchup chart. As you can see, it's favored into a lot of things. The weaknesses that it shares, at least on the front page, there's a few more pages to this, but the ones that we expect to be seeing are Nami Zoe, Lee Sin Zoe, and Bandle Pirates. Now, anything within like a 45 to 55% range, I'm willing to kind of ignore and say, depending on how good the player is on either side, you could feasibly swap this. But Nami Zoe really sits in the meta as a good deck against Draven Scion, and then you see Lee Sin Zoe down at the bottom, and you're like, oh no, how are we going to fit, these two Zoe decks into our lineup? Because the answer is not to put Fizz in one of them. The answer, as Cephalopod has come up with earlier in the week, I believe, is to play Tahm Kench Nami. And it looks exactly like Zoe Nami, or not exactly like it, there's a few cards off. You put in like Astral Protections and things like that, but It's very reminiscent of the Tom Kench Aphelios decks that we were seeing in the Aphelios Temple meta that I was a really big fan of. It hoses the Nami mirror, and I think that more often than not, when you see Nami in a lineup, it is probably going to try and be alongside a Lee Sin Zoe deck, or at least the ones that are finding success, because you can just throw Nami in a lineup, right? You could play Nami and I guess like Bandle Pirates and like Draven Scion, just try to brute force your way through it, call it a day, but again, I'm not a huge fan of that strategy. But I do think a lot of high-level players are going to pick up on the fact that like you can run Tom Kench Nami and Lee Sin Zoe in the same lineup and then try to find a third deck that's favored into the Draven Scion. Like if we go to the next page, like we're not finding a lot here. You're probably going to have to grab something that's more in like that 50% range, like maybe Darkness is your final deck, and you're like, hey, I know that the matchup chart says 52% favored, but I'm a better Darkness player than everybody else, so I can actually turn this favored for Darkness, which is how I would imagine it works out if the Darkness player and the Scion player are both like masters of their deck. I would imagine then it flips over into Darkness favored, but you know, just like bring those two decks, find a third deck that isn't getting bodied, and I think Lee Sin Zoe has a really good matchup into Ziggs Poppy. So, you know, this is like the one kind of matchup where you get to open up your ban strategy a little bit, because I would imagine most lineups are going to be on the ban Scion train. So you get a little bit more ban flexibility by playing Nami and Lee Sin together. I do think that the Tom Kench is the way to do it in the Nami Zoe rather than like playing Lee Sin Fizz, just because I'm not big on non-Targon Lee Sin. I never have been. Maybe that's a blind sight of like, maybe that's a blind spot of mine, and someone's going to top with like Fizz Lee Sin and Nami Zoe and all this other stuff. But personally, I feel like Tom Kench Nami, Lee Sin Zoe, really strong start to a lineup where you get to have a little bit more flexibility in the ban strategy. So that's sort of the main plot of the meta, is ban Draven Scion unless you are specifically looking to soft counter it with something like a Nami Zoe and a Lee Sin. But then again, you know, you have to make the consideration of like, oh, can I run Tom Kench Nami? Things get a little bit wonky. And that's I'm not going to get a lot on the nose in this meta rundown. You know, you kind of have to take the information and form your own conclusions, but like the data is a little bit all over the place, but it does all seem to point towards ban Draven Scion unless you can find a way to play Nami and Lee Sin in the same lineup. Then Darkness control is something that has just been performing pretty well across the board. You know, if you are someone who is confident in your ability to beat Draven Scion as a Darkness player, then maybe you can even shift your ban strategy over to the Poppy decks, because that is an area where Darkness is not doing as phenomenally because it does struggle with healing. Generally, like Withering Wail and Vile Feast is the only healing that you're seeing in a deck like this outside of the Ixtali Sentinel, but getting Lifesteal to connect against these decks can be a little bit challenging. And then Lee Sin, I want to highlight Lee Sin for a second, because this one might seem like it's coming out of nowhere to you, right? The matchup charts for Lee Sin look pretty insane, especially into the top three decks. We're looking at like Draven Scion, Nami Zoe, Poppy Ziggs. You're very favored into the Draven Scion on the Poppy Ziggs, and then you're favored into Nami Zoe. You know, you get bodied by Darkness, but once again, this is not a deck that we are expecting to see a lot of. You do very well into Bandle Pirates, which is another pretty popular third deck among a lot of players. And then like you can kind of ignore this red, right? It's like Bandle Tree, which is probably going to be the least popular Poppy deck. The Shell Folk deck is a very volatile thing for players to bring because of all the burn in the meta. Lurk, again, not something you're going to need to deal with. And then look, here's another Gangplank deck, another deck where the Lee Sin is overperforming. So that's kind of where Lee Sin comes in, is it does very well into all of the tier 1 decks, and you can really kind of splash this into any lineup for that reason. And I think it is a bit of a better third deck choice than something like Bandle Pirates per se, which is a little bit more swingy on its matchup charts. But yeah, that's kind of where tier 1 falls out. Lee Sin doing very well into all the tier 1 decks, as well as like the lower tiered decks that we are expecting to see. Like, yeah, maybe you get bodied by Shellfolk Ezreal. We're not going to see a lot of Shellfolk Ezreal. I think that it is very fine for you to bring Lee Sin. And encouraged even. This is a deck that I've always been a big fan of, especially as the seasonal comes around, and a lot of players get to show off how good they are with this. I think Lee Sin will likely be top 5 represented decks among the top 32 players, as it tends to be. I don't think it's going to necessarily grab the top 3 presence like it used to, but I might be underestimating people's willingness to play Lee Sin. Like, I always feel like Lee Sin should be a top 3 deck, but you know, it's not always something that's super popular. So we'll see, because I would imagine that Draven Scion's going to be number 1. Probably Ziggs Poppy's going to be number 2. And then, yeah, maybe number 3 is Lee Sin. Maybe it's Nami. It's definitely one of those two, I think, in terms of like top 3 decks that we expect to see when we actually get to the top 32, not necessarily for you to play against in Swiss. A lot of the things in tier 2 either have like a very specific place in the meta, or they're powerful but have consistency issues, or like they're powerful but they have a very bad matchup into too many of the tier 1 decks. For example, like Sivir Demacia is a deck that I've been really big on lately. I've been playing it a lot on ladder. It's a really bad matchup into Draven Scion, and it's not necessarily like doing great into Ziggs Poppy either. Now, there are some things that, like, these are decks that you're probably going to need to tech outside of the standard variation in order to find success with. Like, Thralls does very well into the control decks. Like, if you are expecting people to bring a lot of, like, Lee Sin and Darkness and all these things to, like, counter the Draven Scions, that's kind of where Thralls is going to fall into your lineup. You can still ban the Scion decks, and then, you know, you kind of roll the dice with the Poppy deck that you're playing against, but not everyone's going to be running decks like that. And I think that Thralls still has, like, a very nice matchup chart into the control decks, and you can probably outplay some of the aggressive players by just loading up your deck on healing, because once again, you already kind of naturally beat these control decks. You can, you know, sort of levy for the aggro matchup a little bit better. Plunder has consistency issues, and Bandle Pirates, like, these are just two solid decks, but they've never really felt like they're anything more than solid. And it's all preference, right? Like, Gangplank is a very powerful champion. I wouldn't fault anybody who brings it. I do think that Bandle Pirates is a little bit better than Plunder, but it really depends on what the rest of your lineup is, because Plunder is going to do a little bit better into other mid-range decks. Bandle Pirates, from my understanding, has actually been doing fairly well into aggro and other, like, board-based decks, because that Lecturing Yordle just does an insane amount of work in terms of the body that he presents, as well as those little pings coming out and just picking apart the board. But overall, Make It Rain still has a very nice place in the meta, and that's kind of where these two decks are finding their powerhouses. It's just a matter of, like, do I want to try to burn you out, or am I trying to play towards that Sejuani game plan, which still obviously has a place in the meta. Shellfolk Ezreal, if you're comfortable on this and you're very good at it, I would recommend, yeah, you know, you could bring this, but its matchups into the burn portions of the meta are just abysmal. So this is not something I would recommend bringing, but I could definitely see you finding success with it, either if you're very practiced in those matchups, because you do have decent chances into some of, like, again, the controller decks of the meta. Like, if people go full big brain and they're like, oh man, there's gonna be all this aggro, I need to bring the control lineups to beat all the aggro, like, that's where your Shellfolk Ezreal is gonna come in, that's where your Thralls are gonna come in, and it's like a little big brain and pretty highbrow, but I think that you can get a 7-2 finish with it. If you need to go 8-1, I would not recommend bringing Shellfolk Ezreal, but if you're a 7-2 player, yeah, I could definitely find you having success with something like this. FTR fallen down a little bit, not only because I think that people are going to go a little highbrow and bring, like, counters to FTR like Lee Sin and Shellfolk Ezreal, and Darkness even, but I'm just not in love with consistency that FTR has. I feel like it's still losing to burn a little bit more often than it should, and again, it's not beating Draven Scion, and then it's not doing as well into Nami Elusives as you would want it to. The one thing I can say about Feel the Rush is, with a lot of the Poppy decks outside of Ziggs Poppy going more towards a Yordles in Arms style of gameplay, Ruination Stonks do get a little bit stronger, because your opponent is looking to play a slow speed spell pre-combat, and then whatever board they set up after the fact is not going to be nearly as strong as what they had presented beforehand. So I think Feel the Rush will still show up a little bit. I don't think it's going to be a wildly popular deck. I don't think you should ever really be banning it. We're not going to see, like, a repeat of She Who's Worlds run where, like, someone is on Feel the Rush and this Draven K. Like, no one is bringing She Who's Worlds lineup, right? That's just not happening. Maybe we'll even see more Zoe Heimerdinger than I'm expecting, but it just seems like every Zoe deck is doing well into Draven Scion, and you can only fit so many of those in a lineup with different considerations for the champions. Again, I think Nami is the most flexible in that regard, because we do have this very last-minute Tahm Kench tech coming out that I'm a big fan of. And then Sivir Demacia, something I've been a big fan of. I feel like this deck is one of the most skill-expressive decks that we have right now. Like, if you play extremely tight Rune Terror, you will be rewarded. It's one of the reasons that we only saw one Sivir Demacia in Top Cut of the World Championship with Allen, and it did end up winning the tournament. It can be teched more than I think people are giving it credit for. Like, something like Radiant Guardian can really help swing your Ziggs Poppy matchup. It won't do as much for you in the Draven Scion as you need it to, but I think that you can very feasibly bring Sivir Demacia into an open field and do very well. Like we had mentioned, Sivir Demacia, Plunder, and Ziggs Poppy was making up winning lineups in the Mastering Runeterra events, both in America 2 weeks ago and Europe this past weekend. So it certainly has a place, but I think that you want to play a little bit safer and bring a little bit of lifesteal if you can afford to, or some quicksands or something. Just tech out the deck a little bit more towards your own preferences, because it's a very expressive deck, both in playing it and the deck building portion. You know, as we get into tier 3, there are a lot of these decks I cannot see actually popping up, but they're here. They might pop up. TF Noxus is probably the least likely to do anything. You know, you've got the TF Gangplank, which is probably just, like, one of the worst Gangplank decks that we have right now that's viable. And then TF Swain, of course, I cannot harp enough on how poorly this deck performed for Realkey at the World Championship. It just looked really bad. and I don't think that's changing, especially as we have more burn-focused decks. Like, you kind of fall into the same problem that Draven Caitlyn is having right now, where you don't handle burn very well. You're much more an anti-mid-range deck where you can handle everything and let your flocks really do the work, but when there's all these 1 HP units, it's not really enough. Now, maybe TF Swain is doing a little bit better than I'm giving it credit for, because I do think that Flock is okay in the meta, and I think Make It Rain is pretty good in the meta, so combining them into the same deck, I think is a little bit more of a bait than I'm making it sound like, and you just should not be bringing these. But players still will. They're comfortable on them, and we'll see it perform a little bit. I'd be surprised if any of them made top 32, but it's certainly not out of the question. Pirates and discard, you should probably just throw out the window. When Pin Ping Ho brought the triple aggro lineup in order to out aggro the Nami Zoe at the World Championship, he didn't have access to Ziggs Poppy, and that's one of the reasons that it didn't work out so well. I think one of these might have a chance in sneaking into a Nami Zoe sort of anti-lineup. Like, if you want to bring Ziggs Poppy and discard aggro and let's say Bandle Pirates, just for the sake of argument, like, that will do phenomenally, like infinitely better into a Nami lineup than Ziggs Poppy, Bandle Pirates, and Draven Scion. You sort of take their counter matchup out of the lineup and you put in discard aggro, but I think Bandle Pirates, discard, and Ziggs Poppy is specifically the only lineup where I could see someone wanting to bring discard aggro and finding success with it. Lurk, a little bit too volatile, not only in the way that it plays the game, but also in its matchups. Like, it does terribly into Draven Scion. It does very well into Nami Zoe. So again, maybe Lurk is like another deck that you're looking for if you want to be countering these Nami lineups that are looking to counter the Draven Scion, which is typically not where aggro is looking to be. Like, you're not usually running it as like a counter to a counter lineup, but that seems to be where it's falling in. And I think that Ziggs Poppy, discard Lurk is probably like the best 3 decks that you could bring if you are looking to just body Nami elusives. Of course, there is another way to do it, right? You can bring control and just always kill the Nami on sight or kill the elusives on sight. That is like a very real possibility, but only time will tell how these aggro players actually play out. I wouldn't worry too much about like a triple aggro boogeyman going into the weekend, unless like you consider Draven Scion aggro. Like, I think is the most popular aggressively statted lineup we're going to get is Ziggs Poppy, Bandle Pirates, Draven Scion. I don't think we're going to see a lot of like Lurks and discard aggros popping up, but that is sort of their place in the meta, and I wanted to highlight that. Frostbite midrange, if you haven't, check out my article that I wrote for Giant Slayer on the competitive wrap-up. I say my piece on Frostbite midrange, where for too long I have been baited into putting this into tier 2, and no longer will I fall for that. Anivia, if you just want to play something a little bit different than Feel the Rush for some reason, like there are reasons to play Anivia over FTR. I think one of them would be the Darkness matchup. So if you're like bringing this control-y lineup and you're worried about just running into random Darkness players while you're looking to ban one of the power decks, then yeah, that would be a reason to switch over to Anivia. And then Draven Caitlyn, how the mighty have fallen. These Tri-Beam decks were doing so good, looking so good at the World Championship. Maybe, for a little while they were overtaking Draven Scion in popularity and consistency, but nowadays I think this might actually be a bait where this was one of the fallback decks for the longest time, and I think that's one of the reasons that the meta is so open going into this seasonal, is a lot of the fallback decks have fallen off. They've been countered. Draven Ezreal is no longer the safe choice that it once was. Lee Sin was never like the safest choice, but it's sort of the only one that's stuck around. Like Shen Fiora, totally off the map. There's just no comfort decks that players can really fall back on and feel good about. Just, these are the decks that I've always been playing. Like, let me bring Frostbite midrange and Draven Ezreal and Lee Sin and call it a day. You can't do that anymore. And I think that some players that do end up bringing this because they're like, this is the deck that I play, this is what I'm comfortable on, it's not going to work out for them. There are some cracked Draven Ezreal players out there that are still going to end up performing with the deck, but I do not think that your average player can just bring Draven Caitlyn or Draven Ezreal and find the success that they previously have in other seasonal tournaments. So that about wraps it up. Again, not everything in this video is going to be useful to you, but I do hope that you were able to find 1 or 2 nuggets of wisdom that maybe make something click in your head and help you figure out your lineup. Now, this is coming out on Wednesday, so you still have a little bit of time to utilize the information that I've presented. The big one being, test out that Tahm Kench Nami like I had mentioned. It does phenomenally in the mirror, which is really nice because a lot of the mirror matches right now are kind of rough. Another thing that I wanted to highlight is if you are bringing Draven Scion alongside like Bandle Pirates and Ziggs Poppy, we saw Samantha Honey do this at the Mastering Runeterra tournament where they played a much more aggressive version of the Draven Scion, putting in Noxian Fervors and Captain Farron and things of that nature. Like, none of the decks feel like they are a solved 40 cards outside of Ziggs Poppy. That one's kind of been solved since day one. There's a lot of flexibility and expression that you can play in these decks, and I highly encourage you to do so and not feel like you just need to net deck the best version. You can definitely play it to your own style and still find success, and I encourage you to do so. Now, were I playing this weekend, here's where I would actually run into a couple of problems because most of what I've been playing has been Draven Scion, but I feel like I'm a big fan of the Tommy, Nami, and the Lee Sin lineup, and I kind of want to put my money where my mouth is and bring something like that. I'm not as well-versed on Darkness as I should be, so I feel like my lineup for this weekend would be Nami Zoe, Lee Sin, Bandletree. And it's not the most solid lineup in the world, but those are decks that I'm comfortable with and exist in the space that I want to be in, sort of just like not losing to aggro. But yeah, that's what I would bring. I look forward to seeing what everybody else brings. I hope that some of this was useful to you and can help you get to that top 32, even though we're not playing for Worlds qualification or anything like that. But thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.